for organizing and hosting today's event, which looks like a great opportunity for us to mobilize our minds and ideas in the ways we are understanding what we eat and how it's produced and the possibilities for thinking of the future of our food systems. Just a brief outline for today's program. We're going to start with Pat Mooney. It's wonderful to have you here today, and thank you for coming from so far. John and Zira is unfortunately stuck in some traffic, so we'll shift the program around with Stephen Greenberg from the African Center for Biodiversity, then hearing from Donna Andrews and John, depending on when he arrives. So I'll just introduce each speaker, and then we'll have a time at the end for collective contribution, questions, sharing of ideas. Pat Mooney has more than 4 decades experience working in international civil society, first addressing aid and development issues, and then focusing on food, agriculture, and commodity trade. In 1977, Mooney co-founded RAFI, the Rural Advancement Fund International, which was renamed ETC Group in 2001. He received the Right Livelihood Award in the Swedish Parliament in 1985 and the Pearson Peace Prize from Canada's Governor-General in 1998. He has also received the American Giraffe Award given to people who stick their necks out. In 2017, Pat was awarded an honorary degree, Doctor of Laws from the University of Waterloo, for his extraordinary contributions to the protection of plant genetic resources and to improving the livelihoods of the world's small-scale farmers. The author or co-author of several books on the politics of biotechnology and biodiversity, Pat Mooney is widely regarded as an authority on issues of global governance, corporate concentration, and intellectual property monopoly. Although much of ETC's work continues to emphasize plant genetic resources and agricultural biodiversity, the work expanded in the early 1980s to include biotechnology. In the late 1990s, the work was further expanded to encompass a succession of emerging technologies such as nanotechnology, synthetic biology, geoengineering, and new developments in genomics and neurosciences. ETC Group remains a nano-CSO with offices in Canada, the United States, Mexico, and the Philippines, and works in close cooperation with many civil society partners around the world. Stephen Greenberg is a researcher and research coordinator at the African Center for Biodiversity, a Johannesburg-based NGO working on seed systems, agroecology, and food sovereignty, mainly in Southern and East Africa. Stephen has worked for over 20 years in the NGO sector in South Africa, especially in fields of food, agriculture, and land. John Nzira was born in Zimbabwe in the Manica Land province in a rural village in Makoni district. He studied agroecology and permaculture and received international sponsorship for training in environmental education, ecological agriculture in Canada, USA, and Israel. He is an internationally accredited permaculture facilitator, received his permaculture training in Zimbabwe at the Fambizanai Permaculture Institute, and had further training with Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture in the late 1980s. John was instrumental in bringing permaculture to Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, and South Africa. He founded Ukuvuna in 2005 and has a history of successful implementation of many community projects in the SADC region and believes in working together to make a difference. John and Ukuvuna hosted high-powered delegates from international organizations such as BRICS, World Overview of Conservation Approaches and Technology, and has worked with South Africa National Botanic Institute, Gauteng Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, and in partnership with various other public institutes, private, non-governmental organizations, local, international universities. He established projects in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, and in South Africa. And lastly, Donna Andrews, who we'll hear from later, is a radical African ecofeminist. She works on capitalism and nature, focusing on land, mining, and fishing in post-apartheid South Africa. She worked in the Jubilee South debt movement and was active on trade and trade-related issues in South and Southern Africa. She is a member of the Rita Edwards Collective, a feminist solidarity organization engaged in anti-sexist, anti-heteronormative, anti-patriarchal struggles. She is political economist and a researcher in Food Politics and Cultures Project, funded by the Mellon Foundation, located at the University of the Western Cape. So with no further ado, we'd like to welcome Pat Mooney to share with us. Thank you.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. I have to stay here because you're filming, right? Is that the case? It's all right. That's just not a problem. Thank you for coming, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. When I got on the plane last night, I was flying from Geneva through Istanbul to here. I was thinking that I really want to read the papers when I get off the plane, because everything changes in South Africa about every 24 hours, it seems. And what will I land to? Who's going to get booed off a stage? I hope it's not me this time. The rest of the world is watching and fascinated by what's happening, alarmed by what's happening, and hopeful by what's happening as well. I just wish you well in all of that. And to me, it was important to come here because of the role that South Africa plays in Africa, and the role that South Africa plays in the global South on the issues that we're talking about today in terms of food issues, particularly around agricultural input issues. Can you hear me okay? Is it all right? Okay, good. So I'll come to that, and we know that the essence of the conversation, I guess, from my part at least, is to look at the mergers that are now before us, that are being approved by the South African government and some other governments, and challenged by other governments, what those mergers actually mean, and frankly, what's the next round of mergers after those mergers? What's the next step? Because there will be other mergers, and I'd like to lay out some of those other mergers. But that's the immediate issue. I think we need to step back a bit, if you don't mind, and talk more about how we got to this place in the first place. How could you imagine us being in a world where it seems okay for governments, for anti-cartel offices, for anti-competition offices, to say to us that we can have 3 companies control 60% of the world's commercial seed sales, and those same 3 companies are allowed to own 71% of the world's commercial pesticide sales? How can we get to that stage? When I first, my resume needs to be updated, actually. It's been 50 years I've been involved in this stuff now. And when I first got involved, the assumption about corporate concentration was that if you had 4 companies that collectively controlled about half of the marketplace for any commodity in any geographic setting, then that was a kind of de facto oligopoly and had to be broken up. We're so far past that definition now. We're shot so far beyond that, with 3 companies having, and let's summarize it really. If we look at all of the agricultural inputs, and we look at who's really in control of those, we're down to really 3 companies, and we could throw in BASF perhaps as a 4th, but certainly not more than 4, have 75% of all of the money spent on agricultural research in the private sector in the world. 75%. So that's an incredible domination and power. But it's not the first time we've had big companies moving into what you think would be a highly diversified system. Seeds, plant breeding, seed companies should be diversified. That's just logical given the nature of seeds and crops and livestock, seeds and soils and so on. There should be great diversity. But we can go back to the 1920s when the biggest seed company in the world was General Electric. General Electric decided that they had a radiation technology that was working really well, making lots of funny things, and wouldn't it be possible to actually radiate plants and see if we could make them create mutations there and control those mutations to advance plant breeding? Well, it tried that for just long enough to get the American government excited about it. So when the US was trying to explain why it was blowing up atom bombs around the world, starting in the 1950s especially, the Eisenhower administration in the United States decided to adopt General Electric's strategy for radiation plant breeding and introduced the Atoms for Peace program. And that still exists, in fact. You still have programs between FAO and Rome and the International Atomic Energy Agency together doing radiation plant breeding. It's mostly absurd and ridiculous and expensive and actually dangerous. But they keep on doing it. General Electric, however, realized it wasn't going to work. They sold off their interest to the US government and went on to do other things. The next time we had a major company get involved in seeds and also in pesticides and also in fertilizers was what was then Standard Oil of New Jersey. And that was post-World War II in the 1960s, the very beginning of the 1970s, Standard Oil decided that they could make a business in the global south with the Green Revolution if they could put together, through their retail system, of course, their petrol stations, they could sell seeds and pesticides and fertilizers to farmers. Well, that didn't last very long either. Within a couple of years, they dropped out of it. Third round was Royal Dutch Shell. Royal Dutch Shell, in the late 1970s, thought they could make a market out of particularly plant breeding and pesticides together. And they were, for a time, the world's largest seed company. They bought more than 100 other small seed companies around the world. And again, dropped it. And we've now moved into this other phase. The phase in which we had pharmaceutical companies and pesticide companies, not oil companies, deciding that they could make a market out of bringing seeds and pesticides together. And in the 1970s, I remember traveling literally around the world, warning, and this is 1977, 78, 79, warning governments that what we were seeing was the takeover of seeds, family seed companies, by pesticide and pharmaceutical companies that were really together. And they were doing that to really gain a monopoly, and they were doing it under the pretense that it was an urgent necessity to get bigger, get larger, because they needed to feed the world. The arguments were made in the 1970s, I recall really well. And I remember that the Seed Trade together put together a booklet titled Feeding the 500 Million. And it was their task to feed the rest of the world. And to do that, they needed to be able to control an emerging new set of technologies, which were then called genetic engineering, to control those technologies so that in controlling them, they would need to have a global marketplace. They couldn't develop a technology that powerful, that risky, that expensive, unless they could be assured of having a world market. So they needed to have then from governments a few small things. This is the 1970s. What they needed from government was, one, intellectual property rights over plant varieties, the same as they had for pesticides and for pharmaceuticals. Secondly, they needed to have the public sector step back and let them advance their new technology, their new genetic engineering technology. The public sector couldn't afford to do it, and the public sector couldn't take the risk, political risk, so step back and simply provide services to these new companies, help them to develop the technology. In other words, the public sector should be the handmaidens of the private sector. And the third thing they needed was for governments to look the other way when they carried out their mergers. Change the way you look at mergers to say we need to have this scale in a global context, so let us go ahead. And governments looked the other way as all the small family seed companies around the world disappeared. In 1977, there were 7,000 different small family seed companies around the world. 7,000. Not one of them had even 1% of the world market. Not one. How that's changed. But the argument was there. The technology requires the scale. You've got to give us the freedom to operate and keep out of our way. And the dream of this new suite of technologies, which we now call the GMOs and so on, that suite of technologies were why it had to happen. Only they could perform and produce that kind of technology. And they did it. I remember in arguments with companies in front of governments saying that what we would see is the development of herbicide-tolerant plant varieties. We first predicted that in 1980, it wasn't just us, in 1981. That the logic was that the companies would move in that direction. They had this pesticides, they had the seeds, they created technology that one depended upon the other. We didn't call it biotechnology. We weren't quite sure how it was going to work, But if you simply followed the money, the logic of how they would do their R&D would be to try to create synergy between those two products. We weren't sure how it would happen. Both the public sector scientists and the private sector scientists accused us all of being slightly crazy, that this couldn't be done, it was impossible. I can still pull out the documents of various scientific associations in Canada, in Switzerland, and so on, who said this was an absurd fantasy. You could never have herbicide-tolerant plant varieties. Well, we all know where that went. Today, what is it now? Mary, I'm sure, knows better than I do. Worldwide, it's close to 80% of all of the biotech seeds, at least having them in part of it, or stacked traits of herbicide-tolerant plant varieties with other traits. So it's overwhelming for the crops they work in. But the mergers were allowed to happen because of this promise of the new technologies. And by the end of the 1990s, when Monsanto also moved into the market, because Monsanto wasn't there initially, by the end of the 1990s, we looked like we were in a static situation where they couldn't get any bigger. Where until 3 years ago, 2 years ago even, although the discussion about the mergers now is 3 years old, but even 2 years ago, if you looked at the market share, there were 6 companies. And the 6 companies had the kind of control we're talking about now, almost 2/3 of the world's seeds, almost 3/4 of the world's pesticides, 3/4 of the world's agricultural research in the private sector. How could they possibly become more concentrated than that? Why would they even need to become more concentrated than that? They've all cross-licensed each other. They claim they're not going to fight anymore over patents, which means, in other words, they can collude. So they swap licensing arrangements with one another and keep everybody else out. And they could claim that, and they could sort of fix prices together. When you have 6 companies, fixing prices doesn't have to be negotiated. You simply watch each other and move along together. There's no requirement for shady deals. It just happens. And so they could do all of that. They could also control the amount of money they put into research because they had sorted out the market for themselves in most places in the world. Not everywhere, but most places. So why would there be a requirement for further mergers? And that's a question that we'll come back to because there are strong reasons for it. So then, 3 years ago, rumors began to come up that somehow these companies were going to start to move. And the one thing that everybody said is if any 2 of these 6 companies come together, and let me list them for you just in case for those less familiar with this. We're talking then about in the United States, Dow and DuPont and Monsanto, and we're talking about Syngenta and Bayer and BASF in Europe. Those are the 6. And any 2 of those 6 started to come together, all 6 would have to move. It was simply common sense. You can't have 2 getting bigger and messing up the marketplace without the other 4 having to do something about it, having to position themselves to survive and not be left out of any future developments. So everyone knew that. It was not a surprise to the seed industry or the pesticide industry. Every financial monitor of agriculture had the same conclusions. They start to move, they all move. The only people who didn't pay any attention to that were the anti-competition lawyers and their offices in governments around the world. Now the moves have started to happen. And the surprise only, and not much of a surprise, was that one of the companies that moved in was a Chinese company, Syngenta. ChemChina, offering to buy Syngenta. And the rumors of Chinese interest in this go back at least 7 or 8 years, but it's only been the last 3 years that we thought maybe they really will move this time, and now they have. And the only other surprise is that the odd one out of this among the 6 companies is BASF, the big, huge German chemical, pharmaceutical, agricultural company. BASF has stood back from it, but BASF has said, when these mergers happen, a lot of companies are going to fall off the table. Divestitures will take place, we'll pick them up. And they've said that quite bluntly. So they still will be in the game, and there's other steps they could be taking as well, and I'll come to that. So, and what is now the argument for the mergers? Why are they moving from basically 6 to 3 or 4, depending how you look at it? What's the rationale? How do you go to competition offices around the world and say, we need to do this. Exactly what they said back in the 1970s. There's no change at all. We're living in a world which has climate change. We can't be assured. Well, they didn't say that in the 70s, but the argument is still there. We need to be able to respond to unknown conditions in the future. To do that, we need to have a new technology, a new suite of technologies to get us through that, to help us to adjust rapidly to these changing climatic conditions. And that new suite of technologies is called new breeding techniques. It's called GMOs 2.0. It's called synthetic biology. It's called CRISPR-Cas9. It's called gene editing, gene drives, and so on. It's that suite of technologies that really turned DNA into digital DNA. It really is the digitization of biological materials. That's what they're looking at. But it's big, it's expensive, it's risky, for us more than them. And somehow they say to adjust to climate change, we need to move these technologies out. And as they've said that, of course, they say, so we have to get bigger one more time. We have to really command the cloud of this big data in order to get us through the problems ahead of us. And they add on to that, of course, besides climate change, we have changing consumer demand, particularly in Asia and Latin America, and we have the pressures of increased population as well. So all those standard arguments are there with climate change. And that's why governments are, some at least, apparently possibly South Africa, are capitulating to the pressure of the mergers. So what's actually behind that? What are they afraid of that is causing them to come together? Why are they even risking the possible public opposition to the mergers? And while the opposition has moved up rather rapidly in the last few weeks, it was slow because 3 years ago we could see the configuration of these mergers. It was not a surprise. And certainly 2 years ago it was absolutely clear. The detail of the mergers was really quite clear. So why is it that are they putting themselves in this kind of risky environment where they could be slapped down? Well, it again goes back to big data. Because while Syngenta and ChemChina and Dow and DuPont and Monsanto and Bayer have been negotiating, other companies have been moving in as well. We have the large farm machinery companies. It always surprises me that consumers, at least, don't quite get it in terms of the scale of the companies we're talking about. When we talk about the seed industry, everyone thinks that Monsanto must be one of the world's biggest companies. It's got to be almost up there with Exxon and Apple or something. There's this image of Monsanto as being huge. Well, Monsanto of itself is not even half the size of John Deere, the world's largest farm machinery company. If you take all of the big seed and pesticide, you take the total market for seeds and pesticides together, it comes to about $97 billion in sales per year. All together. John Deere and 3 other farm machinery companies, 4 companies together, have sales of about $114 billion. Just 4 companies. When I say seed and pesticides, I mean all of them, not just the top 6 or something like that, the whole market. So they're much bigger. And beginning in 2000, it may have gone back earlier than that, but we can't trace it there. Beginning in 2000, what we were seeing happening was that John Deere and AGCO and NCH and so on, Case New Holland, CNH, pardon me, were all together moving into big data, moving into drones, moving into satellite information, putting sensors onto their tractors, into the combines, so they could monitor the soil conditions, so they could monitor harvests, what was being put in and what was being taken out of the field, and tie that to historic information about weather and climate and historic information about markets. To the point where suddenly in 2013, as we saw the real movements taking place in the background among the seed and pesticide companies, as that was just beginning to happen, John Deere moved very quickly and made deals with all of the 6 companies, all of the big 6 in seeds and pesticides. It's got joint ventures with Bayer, Monsanto, BASF, Dow, DuPont, and Syngenta, not with ChemChina. And the relationships are to share data and to use each other's materials as well, their equipment, to try to get a better handle on, again, everything that's happening to farmers everywhere in the world. Now, the seed and pesticide companies tried to move there as well, but they're totally tied up in the big data around genomics. How do you manipulate DNA? And I won't have time to describe it right now, but maybe in the discussion period, we'll spend more time, or Stephen will probably say more about it as well. But there's a lot to do around that activity. But finally, the point is, if these mergers are allowed to go through today, then the next round of mergers will not be next year or the year after. It may take 3 to 5 years. But I will guarantee you, the next round of mergers will mean the farm machinery companies move in and take over the seed and pesticide companies. And their argument will be, we need to have that control of data to respond to climate change, population increases, and to actually manage the risk so we can feed the world in the future. The same old arguments. And because these mergers have been accepted, because it seems to be, unbelievably, it seems to be that governments believe that it's okay to have 3 companies control, almost everything in terms of inputs, in seeds and chemicals at least, then they will accept the next step. We need to attach on the farm machinery companies. And why will the farm machinery companies win? Because they've got the box. This is one of those occasions where you're supposed to think inside the box, not outside the box. They've got the box that accepts the seeds, the pesticides, and the fertilizers at planting time, that's in the field during the growing season, spraying and so on, and is that there at harvest time, it's their box that collects the crop. They've got the information. And they've been gathering that information intensively since the year 2000. They know more than anyone else does, and way more than farmers know about markets and weather conditions down the road. They have the best chance of controlling everything. And they've got the deep pockets, way deeper than Bayer, BASF, or Monsanto have. So one really critical reason for stopping these mergers now is to make sure we don't set the stage for the next round of mergers after that. And we're already seeing companies like BASF together with John Deere looking at crop insurance. I mean, if you've got the data, you know the history, then all you have to do is go to the farmers and say, hey, if you use our inputs and do it in this way with our machinery and our sensors, then we'll give you a good deal on crop insurance. If you don't, forget it. And these same companies that are now dealing with crops, of course, are also looking at livestock, increasingly so, because it's the same genomics, the same big data management, and livestock to a smaller degree, and we're not sure where this is going to finally end up, around veterinary medicines. The area that they're not looking into until, at least very closely, until just the last 2 days, has been fertilizers. The fertilizer industry is even bigger than the farm machinery industry or the seed and chemicals industry combined. But they're more diversified. It's very much a mine-by-mine based system. It's very much geography-based and very tightly tied to state companies. And so they haven't really been players in the game. Until, of course, 2 days ago, when the front story in the Financial Times in the UK was that Sinochem was going to buy ChemChina, which is buying Syngenta. Sinochem is one of the world's top 10 fertilizer companies, much, much bigger than ChemChina. And of course, ChemChina is buying Syngenta. So Sinochem is also involved in pesticides. So again, a greater concentration is taking place. And by the way, a year ago, when there were rumors that Sinochem might buy ChemChina, the companies denied it and said that would never happen. Once the deal was agreed to in Switzerland, and the board of directors of Syngenta last week only, confirmed they would accept the deal with ChemChina, suddenly Sinochem came in and took over. So we are seeing this huge convergence among agricultural inputs. I mean, I remember when Royal Dutch Shell was in charge of the seed industry, or tried to be in charge of it, in the 1970s. I remember then people saying that, you know, whatever religion you belong to, we all have something similar that we say, which is that to the effect of, give us this day our daily bread. Well, give us this day our daily bread wasn't to be a prayer to Royal Dutch Shell, or to Monsanto, or to Bayer Monsanto, or to John Deere. But our food system is moving exactly down that road. The control of those inputs, all these first links in the food chain, are being dominated now by this handful of very, very large, very, very powerful companies. And that's not safe for the planet. It's certainly not safe for food security in terms of that control they will exercise over our crops and our livestock. We can stop this. How am I doing for time? Am I just about it? Sorry? Okay, thank you. Good. Let me get some good news. Not much, a little bit. This is a winnable battle. First of all, the world woke up to the fact only when these mergers were happening, only when Bayer made its bid for Monsanto in September of last year, end of August, beginning of September last year. Right away, the Committee on World Food Security that meets in Rome every year, all of the governments, together with civil society, scientific community, and the companies as well, was shocked. And there was a move by the South to have an emergency debate on what would these mergers mean for food security. The United States blocked that. Didn't happen. But everyone talked about it anyways. That push will be again this year. There is a sense of alarm around the world that this is going too far. Even the Wall Street Journal was saying this is a threat to food security. Actually, they didn't say that. They said this has implications for world food security. So I think there's an understanding there we haven't had before, that we can possibly fight back on this. But especially the battle is in the South. Because honestly, Brussels and Washington will let these mergers go through. They may cut off a bit here and there, but basically they'll go through. And the next round will go through as well. But those mergers will not happen because of decisions made in Brussels and Washington. They'll happen because of decisions made in the global South. The growing market for pesticides and the growing market for seeds is here. It's a very stagnant market in the North. There's no growth there, very little growth there. If you look at just 4 countries in the South, Argentina, Brazil, India, and China, they account for 33% of agricultural inputs, sales. Just those 4 countries. If they decide, or 2 of them decide, or South Africa together with Kenya, together with Nigeria, together with Argentina or something decide, we don't want these mergers, the shareholders will walk away from the mergers. There is no value in it for them. They can't profit from it.